Okay, so we've been looking at various things going on in the book of Acts, and because I had already committed to teach at Hillcrest for December, this will be the last class for the book of Acts. The next 2 weeks, Tim Graham will be teaching in here, and so we will still have a class here. Now, what I basically want to do is just do a very quick survey of the last 7 chapters of Acts, which may be a little bit ambitious, but I'm really just going to focus on a certain number of things. What I pointed out last time is that Luke has intentionally set the first readers up to believe that the story will end in Acts chapter 21. Right? He has set us up to believe that in 2 ways. One is how he uses geography to tell the story. In the Gospel of Luke, the story begins in Jerusalem, goes outside of Jerusalem, and then ends in Jerusalem. And so much so that in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus ascends to heaven from Jerusalem and not in Galilee, as in Matthew and Mark. You then have the book of Acts starting in Jerusalem. It goes out, then it comes back to Jerusalem, then it goes out to Gentiles and comes back to Jerusalem in chapter 21, which is where we're expecting geographically the story to end. Then we've got the role of prophecy. And the storyline of the book of Acts is based on Isaiah 56, chapter 56, verses 1 through 8, where there are 4 things that are prophesied. First one is the exiles will return, which occurs in Acts chapter 2. Then eunuchs will be included in the kingdom, okay? And that occurs with the Ethiopian eunuch. Okay? And again, been a while since we talked about the Ethiopian eunuch, but eunuchs were excluded from the kingdom according to the law of Moses. And Isaiah says there's going to come a day when that's going to change. The third thing prophesied in Isaiah 56 is that Gentiles will be allowed in the people of God. And the fourth thing to be fulfilled is that they will all offer sacrifices on the altar in the temple. But, as we saw last week, just at the mere rumor that a Gentile had entered into the temple, there's a riot. And they empty out the temple courts and they shut the gates of the temple on God's will. We are not going to fulfill Isaiah 56 in Jerusalem. We are not going to fulfill Isaiah 56 in the physical temple in that city. And so it raises the question, how does this get fulfilled? Now, that's a question from some people. Other people would automatically come to the answer, Christianity cannot be from God. Because if Christianity were from God, then the prophecies about this eternal temple being a place where we can worship God, this place in Jerusalem where eunuchs and Gentiles can join all the others in worship of God, obviously it didn't become true through Christianity, so Christianity's not from God. Right? So we have to remember these very same facts can be interpreted in other ways. And this is one of the reasons why Paul gives us more chapters, because he wants to explain to us how Isaiah 56 is actually fulfilled. In what way do eunuchs and Gentiles and Jews get to worship God in a way that fulfills Scripture? And we've already been introduced to the idea of how that might take place. Because in Stephen's speech, right, which is the longest speech in the book of Acts, in Stephen's speech, he sets us up with this understanding that it is not a physical building that is God's temple, it is the universe. It is what God has created. Right? So At the very climax of Stephen's speech, he starts quoting this passage out of Isaiah. It says, what type of house are you going to build for me? Right? Didn't I create all these things? Isn't the cosmos my throne room and the earth's my footstool? What place of rest can you build for me? So that this opens up the idea that we don't have to stream to Jerusalem, but that in the true fulfillment of the kingdom, the true fulfillment of the prophecies about the temple, it is the God of the universe who is worshiped throughout the universe. Which makes it possible then for Jews who had been trained that the best place to be is Jerusalem to say, wait 1 second. If God is the God of the universe, if that is his throne room, then he is with us wherever we go, and that empowers missions. That empowers people to leave their comfort zone. In the past, in the Old Testament, to leave Jerusalem was punishment. But with Christ, to leave Jerusalem is a blessing. It's a blessing for those who are sent. It's a blessing for those who get to hear the message by those who are sent. So there's lots of different things that Luke does in both the Gospel and the book of Acts to point us in this direction. But if we end the story in chapter 21, it seems like everything has failed. So what ends up happening is Paul starts to go to Rome. And in fact, we are told in the book of Acts that when Paul was in Jerusalem, he had a communication from God that said, I'm going to send you to Rome, just like you've testified about me in Jerusalem. Now, Paul's testifying about Jesus in Jerusalem, in chains, in prison. I mean, it's not the greatest circumstances. We didn't talk about it, but when Paul is called, he is told, as well as Ananias, who is somewhat reticent and anxious about going to see this guy who's persecuting Christians, when God tells him to go baptize Paul, we hear how much Paul must suffer on behalf of the name of God. And so there's this ongoing sense of Paul has been called not just to be an apostle, but to be one who suffers for the kingdom. Lots of things that we didn't get to look at. But what ends up happening in chapters 22 through 28 in the book of Acts is basically a story with heightened tensions. The idea that develops is if Paul gets to Rome, then all of this is from God. If Paul doesn't make it to Rome, it's not from God. And the question is, does Paul get to Rome? And there are all sorts of things that get in the way of Paul getting to Rome. First off, he's arrested in Jerusalem. So we talked about the riot in Jerusalem last week and all of the stuff that entails. We talked about how Paul's granted this opportunity to speak to the crowds that are trying to kill him. The Roman commander makes several political mistakes along the way. And Paul just ends up riling up the crowds even further. So the commander then orders that Paul be laid out to be flogged, and as he's being chained up to be flogged, he points out that he's a Roman citizen, which then means the commander has done something that is guilty of death. So the commander's a little frustrated about that. I mean, he's in serious trouble potentially. And then the commander is going to do the Roman thing. When somebody is arrested, they are presumed guilty until proven innocent. However, you will have a trial within 48 hours, usually within 24 hours. And so the commander sets up a trial. Okay? And according to the Roman law, a person must be confronted by the persons who are making the accusations in court. And that's going to create some interesting problems because we're going to have a number of different scenes where Paul's making a defense. And the first one is the commander calling in people to have a trial for Paul, find out what's going on here. And Lysias doesn't know what's going on. And so we've got Paul, and instead of the accusers showing up to court, it's the religious leaders who show up to court. Okay? They are really vested in getting rid of Paul. And so instead of having the people who should have been the actual accusers, these Jews visiting from Asia Minor, the religious leaders themselves, the Sanhedrin, the council, show up. And as the trial goes on, it becomes clear that it's not going Paul's direction. So, recognizing that the council is made up primarily of Sadducees and Pharisees, he starts speaking Pharisee. Okay? He starts quoting the party line. It's on behalf of the hope of Israel, the resurrection of the dead, because the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They don't believe in angels. So it looks like Paul's in trouble, so Paul saves himself by pitting his group, the Pharisees, against the Sadducees. Right? And then a brawl breaks out. And again, in Rome, that's the worst possible thing that can happen. You've probably heard of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Romans love to keep peace, and the way they keep peace is through gory violence. Go figure. Lots of stories where people have assembled in terms of riots, and all they do is they send in the troops and kill everybody. And that very fact plays a role several times in both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. The Gospel of Luke refers to a time that Pilate kills several thousand men who are worshiping in the temple because there was this riot that broke out. In Ephesus, great is Artemis of Ephesus, right? The crowds are in the big amphitheater and they're chanting, and the city leaders are going, we've got to shut up and go home because the Romans are going to come and kill us all. Right? That everybody knows how this works out. And so Paul realizes that the best way to get out of this is just to create another fight. So he starts hitting all the hot button points between the Pharisees and Sadducees. Hope of Israel, resurrection of the dead. And the Pharisees are going, hey, maybe an angel talked to him, and maybe this and that. And the Sadducees are just going, this is nuts. And so every time the commander tries to find a way to bring peace, things just get worse. And so the commander goes, okay, the court scene did not work. And he finally figures out that it might be better to bump Paul up the chain of command. We're trying to figure out, is Paul going to make it? And the commander says, okay, I'm going to send you to Caesarea to the governor. What do some Jews make an oath about when they hear? Yeah, they will not eat or drink until they have killed Paul. And they have made a plan to kill Paul when he's being transferred. So, Paul's relatives hear about that. His nephew comes and tells Paul. Paul sends the nephew to the commander, and so the commander decides to send a whole bunch of troops with Paul. Now, the number of troops that are sent with Paul is probably a little overkill. But it's not just the people that are waiting to ambush Paul that are a concern. Once you get into the hill country of Galilee at this point in time in history, there are lots of bands of Jews who are following false messiahs who attack Romans. And so Lysias is trying to make sure his troops get there and back safely as well. But you've got, again, what ends up happening is there's not a lot of theological teaching. There's not a lot of depth to, spiritual transformation, things going on. At the end of the story of Acts, it's just, can Paul get to Rome? And it seems like there's a cosmic battle going on. Is God going to win, or are the forces opposed to God going to win? And we got lots of different forces opposed to God in this story. We first encounter the Jewish leadership as being opposed to God. And Paul very quickly totally destroys that court scene. So we then get Paul transferred to, I think it's Felix. I always get Felix and Festus confused. Felix, yeah. Now, again, once we get Felix there, Paul to Felix, things should be settled within 24 to 48 hours. Okay? That's the way it's supposed to work. But politicians don't always do what they're supposed to do. I don't know if you've noticed that. And so Felix decides that maybe he can use Paul as a pawn. That maybe he can manipulate the situation, because the Romans and the Jewish leadership are always in conflict. And each one was always trying to find leverage over the other. And Felix is actually hoping, just like Festus afterwards, is hoping that maybe Paul will give him a bribe to get out of prison. Money is always an issue. And so instead of Paul getting out of prison, he's stuck in prison for 2 years. That's not normally what goes on. And Felix is using him as a pawn. Felix likes listening to what Paul has to say, wants a bribe, and he keeps telling people who want to have a trial that as soon as Lysias the commander comes down for the trial, then we'll have a trial. The problem is that Lysias is not going to come down, and Felix knows this. Okay? Because Lysias sent a letter. Lysias wrote a letter filled with lies. Okay? You got to remember, Lysias the commander has had a whole bunch of really bad things happen to him, in danger of losing his pension, losing his commission in the army, losing his life. I mean, he's made some really big errors in his time with Paul. So when he writes a letter to the governor, he lies. He lies about the situation in which he rescued him. He lies about the way he handled Paul. I mean, in the letter, Lysias looks like a hero. No mention of any of the major flubs that he had committed. But he makes it clear in the letter that Paul is absolutely innocent. He's not guilty of any of the things that he has been accused of. He could be released, but that's the governor's job. And then the governor's saying, well, when Lysias, the commander, comes, then we'll have a trial. Lysias isn't coming. He's written a letter. His testimony for Paul is absolutely clear. He's innocent. Let him go. No, we're going to keep him around. Now, when governorships change in the Roman Empire, one of the things you do is you get rid of all the problems. And so when Felix leaves, what he would have done is released the prisoners that were still issues, so that the incoming governor, in this case Festus, doesn't have anything to deal with. and there's no skeletons in the closet that Festus can find out to report to the emperor about Felix. Except Felix keeps Paul on as a favor to the Jews. So Festus inherits the problem of Paul. Okay? And this occurs in chapter 25. And so Festus is making his rounds as a new governor to see what's going on. The religious leaders want to raise the issue of Paul again. So Festus really doesn't know much about the situation. The religious leaders want Paul back down in Jerusalem. But Festus asks Paul what's his preference, because Paul is a Roman citizen, so he has rights that a lot of other people wouldn't have. We didn't talk about this last week, but it's probably helpful. Only about 30% of the Roman Empire in the first century were citizens of Rome. Citizenship in Rome was a special privilege. We think, right, that everybody who can get a passport in the right type of photo ID is a citizen. But that's not how the Roman Empire worked. The vast majority of what we would call citizens of the Roman Empire actually weren't citizens. Their marriages weren't valid. There's lots of different things that we don't think of when we read the Bible about all of the very significant challenges of what life was like in the Roman Empire. About 50 years before the time recorded here in the book of Acts, only about 10% of the people in Rome were actually citizens. But the government started running short on money. So they started selling citizenship to very expensive people, right? You get your little golden passport or whatever it is. All right. If you can come in with lots of money, then we will sell you citizenship. And Lysias had purchased his citizenship. He was now an official Roman citizen. And he was wondering if Paul had bought his citizenship. And Paul goes, nope, I'm from a very old and well-established Roman family, which makes things worse for Lysias. So Paul has some say in this. And Festus says, hey, you want to go back up to Jerusalem to be tried? It seems to be that this trial is all about your law. And Paul goes, no, that's not a good direction to go. Plus, Paul knows he's supposed to get to Rome. And going back to Jerusalem is going back the wrong direction. So they decide to have the trial in Caesarea. Find my place here. And while he's in Caesarea, let's see if I've skipped too much. Yeah. While he's in Caesarea, King Agrippa decides to come visit. Agrippa, we're familiar with the name. Herod Agrippa. Okay. So Herod the Great, and then people related to Herod the Great get typically called Herod in the New Testament, because Herod the Great is a villain in the New Testament. We don't ever see why he's great in the New Testament story. So typically the descendants, when they're mentioned in the Bible, get to be called Herod. If there's some sort of positive side to them, then they're called Agrippa. But this is Herod Agrippa II. Herod the Great was the first Herod Agrippa. No, it was Herod. His son's Herod Agrippa the first, then grandson's Herod Agrippa the second. It gets really confusing. as to who's doing what where. The first Herod Agrippa is the one that beheaded John the Baptist. So you can see why they don't get good press in the Bible. Right? And Herod is over a small kingdom nearby. And whenever a new governor shows up, because a king is higher than a governor, the kings go on their welcome tours, which is basically a free vacation. They show up and the governor has to entertain them at their own expense. Okay. So Herod and his wife Bernice are coming along for this nice vacation, and they decide to hear about Paul, partially because Felix, again, I keep getting my names mixed up, Festus had this trial, and it's clear again that Paul's not going to win, so Paul appeals to Caesar, which is a right that only Roman citizens have. Okay, if they feel like they're getting a raw deal. Everybody else does get a raw deal. Okay? But if you're a citizen, you get perks, and if you feel like there's a raw deal, you can appeal to Caesar. It's not particularly wise, because Caesars don't like to oversee court cases. Okay? So it's highly risky to appeal to Caesar, but it is a convenient way to get to Rome. Okay? So Paul's making sure he's going to move in the right direction. But we're now in a position where the governor doesn't know what to say. He's going to send Paul to Rome so that the emperor can decide his legal case. But there's no legal case. Right? Everybody who's seen him has said he's innocent, he's innocent, he's innocent. As a governor, you do not want to send an innocent person to the emperor to say, would you hear his court case? Because the emperor's going to go, the guy's innocent. Why are you sending him to me? The governor has found himself in a very serious predicament. Okay? Over and over again, we end up with these Romans who are trying to manipulate the system. All the Romans are corrupt, except for a few centurions in the book of Acts. In the gospel. Festus doesn't know. What's he going to do? Agrippa visits. Okay, so I've got to entertain him for 2 weeks on my own dollar, so maybe I can get Agrippa to listen to Paul, which does make a lot of sense for a couple of reasons. One is Herod the Great really wanted to be a Jew. Now, the Jews were not going to ever let him become a Jew, but he wanted to be a Jew. And I pointed out that when he rebuilt the temple, that he put one of his homes right on the wall of the temple so he could be as close to Judaism as possible. He married a Jewish princess, had semi-Jewish kids, which he then killed, but wanted to be Jewish. And so the Herodian family had always sort of been quasi-Jewish and always very interested in what was going on in terms of Judaism. And so having Herod Agrippa, a major Roman official who's very familiar with and actually leans positively towards the Jews, is a great person as a resource to say, okay, what do I tell the emperor? The other reason that Herod Agrippa is important is because the Herodian family grew up in Rome. Okay, their hometown is actually in Rome, even though they are Edomites. Their family relocated, very wealthy, and all of the Herods grew up with the people who were Caesars. Okay? Herod the Great and Caesar Augustus were childhood friends. Okay? And so there's this very tight-knit relationship between the Herodian families and the emperors. So whatever Herod Agrippa says would carry extra weight with whatever letter of recommendation is sent by the governor to the emperor in relationship to Paul. So, Herod's interested in hearing about this, and so they have this large convocation. They bring in all the important people of the city. It's a really big deal. And they just want to hear, okay, what does Paul have to say? And this is going to be the third time that Paul's conversion is told in the book of Acts. So, the story of Paul's conversion, very, very important. Okay? The story of the conversion of Gentiles, told 3 times in the book of Acts. Okay, so repetition indicates importance. And so Paul's going to get up, he's going to address primarily Herod Agrippa, because Herod Agrippa knows more than most of the other people who are gathered to hear what he has to say. But he just starts telling his story. Says, I came to Jerusalem with money to help the poor, which is not what he should have said in front of any Roman official. But he said, we brought this huge amount of money to help the poor. I was in the temple worshiping, and Jews from Asia Minor came up with the wrong ideas of what's going on. He goes and tells how he was converted, although it's not so much that Paul was converted as he was called in a particular way. But he tells a story about how Jesus appeared to him and called him to be a missionary to Gentiles. And Paul tells Agrippa, and I was true to that. I started doing that immediately. And the reason I bring that up is because it has been sort of commonplace to believe that when Paul spent 2 years in Arabia, or 3 years in Arabia, that what was happening was Jesus was teaching him like he had taught his disciples. But that is to not pay attention to what Scripture actually says. We get the idea of a 3-year ministry of Jesus with his disciples from the Gospel of John. But if you pay attention to the story, the first Passover mentioned in John and the last Passover mentioned in John are the exact same Passover. John split the story in 2. So, Jesus only has a 2-year ministry with his disciples in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Paul is not spending time with Jesus in Arabia for 3 years because Paul tells Agrippa, as soon as I regained my sight, I started doing what I was called to do. He is doing mission work among Gentiles in Arabia. Now, I wish we had concrete details about what all that looked like, because we don't. But Paul takes his calling very, very seriously, and he starts into it. Well, we get to the end of all this, and one of my favorite verses. Verse 24 of Acts chapter 26. Paul, your great learning has driven you crazy, which is sort of how I feel every morning. I need to get a t-shirt that says that. So, you're nuts. Just your great learning. I was going to use it for all my third-year Greek students. So, the governor's still in a predicament. Agrippa says, hey, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, we could just let him loose. So we've got all these Romans that want to let Paul go free, but various situations are working against that. So Paul, it looks like the will of God's not being done. At the same time, you sort of see these little streams where it must be getting done. He's inching closer to Rome. But he's been in prison for years. Nobody stays in prison for years unless it's debtor's prison in the Roman Empire. He should have been freed a long time ago, and just everything seems to be conspiring against him. The Jewish leaders are conspiring against him. We've had 2 governors and a commander and now a king. The Romans are conspiring against him. We even get the Greek gods involved, in a sense, in conspiring against him. We finally get Paul on a boat to Rome. And what happens? Yeah, there's a shipwreck. There's a huge storm that comes up, which would have been strongly associated with Greek gods, or Roman gods, depending on which side you were on. Even the way Luke tells the story of the storm makes it parallel the story of, who is it? Homer writes the Iliad. Who's the hero of the Iliad? Ulysses, there we go, thank you. I just went blank. So, as Luke tells the story of the storm and the shipwreck, there's lots of language and parallels with the story of Ulysses. So we've got these gods and hero type things going on. They get shipwrecked on the island of Malta, and they all survive, right, which is really surprising. Paul had predicted that a lot of people would die, but he prayed to God. God answered his prayers, and everybody was saved. They get on shore. Everybody's drenching wet and cold, so they start building fires. And what happens to Paul? A snake bites him. A poisonous snake bites him. And the locals immediately assume that it's the Fates, okay? Some Greek gods, goddesses actually. But the idea is that if the political system doesn't see that justice is done, then the divine system will. And the Fates are one of the ways that in the Greco-Roman mythology that a person gets what they deserve. So Paul must have been guilty. He survived the shipwreck, and the gods are going to make sure he doesn't go any further. But Paul doesn't die, his hand doesn't swell, and then everybody thinks he's a god. Fickle people. I mean, go back and forth, going all over the place. And then you've got various things that go on in Malta that actually end up very positive for Paul with the governor of that island. And then they get sent off on a ship who have, Luke just tells us that you have on the masthead the twins, talking about the twin gods, Castor and Pollux. So Luke works in the Greco-Roman mythology into all of this, because we're moving towards the climax of the story, and as we get towards the climax of the story, the tension just really increases. Now, we've read the book of Acts so often, and we've tended to read it as modern history instead of ancient history. We don't get that point. But the original readers, this is a nail biter. If Paul gets to Rome, God wins. But it doesn't look like Paul's going to get to Rome. Every time he turns around, somebody's beating him up. Okay? The Jews, the Romans, the gods. Doesn't look like he's going to get there. But eventually he does. And what happens then is some things that were introduced back in chapter 21 with the riot and what precedes get tied together in chapter 28 as well. And I've pointed out that there's always lots of parallels in the book of Acts with people and parallels to Jesus. In the riot, the Jews call out, away with him, talking about Paul. They want him to be killed. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, instead of saying crucify him, they say away with him. And what Luke is doing is connecting the story of Paul with the story of Jesus. Now, the story of Paul is connected to the story of Jesus in a number of different ways, right? We talked about how the healing of lame men connects Peter and Paul to Jesus in the beginning of the ministry. But there's lots of other things that we didn't have time to talk about. But in chapters 21 through 28, we have a lot of parallels of the story of Paul's death with Jesus' death. We've got Jesus resolutely setting his face towards Jerusalem in Luke chapter 9:51. And then we've got this story that brings us to the cross. And we've got Paul resolutely setting his face towards Jerusalem. Right? We've got the Holy Spirit saying, don't go. We've got Agabus saying, if you go, you're going to be bound up like this. All these bad things are going to happen. And the story of Paul's journey, at first towards Jerusalem in chapter 21 and then towards Rome in chapter 28, has all of these significant parallels with the story of Jesus' journey to Jerusalem where he's going to be killed. And the parallels are so strong that it's clear that it's clear that Luke knows that Paul died in Jerusalem. Now, a lot of conservative Christians believe that Paul was under house arrest in Rome for 2 years, got released, went to Spain, and then got arrested again and then killed. That is all fabrication. It's very old fabrication. But there's nothing in Scripture that suggests that that's actually true. And there's lots and lots of evidence that makes it clear that it's not true. Luke knows Paul died in Jerusalem after 2 years of house arrest. The extra ministry that was made up was primarily intended to find a way to fit 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus into Paul's life. I still think they fit Paul's life just earlier rather than later. But we have all of these very clear parallels of Paul resolutely setting his face towards Jerusalem like Jesus did, advanced knowledge that the trip to Jerusalem is going to end, or in this case, the trip to Rome is going to end poorly, in one sense. Okay, death of Jesus, death of Paul. We have references to the fact that the Jews hand over both Jesus and Paul to the Romans. The Romans conclude that both Jesus and Paul are innocent and want to release them, but the Jewish leaders have come up with a second response in order to force the Romans to kill both Jesus and Paul. So there's a lot of language that makes it clear that the end of chapter 28 is about the death of Paul, but we're not ever told about the death of Paul. Because, nor are we told about the death of Peter. When Luke wrote, both were dead and had been for probably 2 decades. Part of the problem is that we often read the book of Acts as a story about Paul. But it's not a story about Paul. Luke Acts is history, and ancient history is about a nation. And Jesus is the king. Peter, Paul are 2 significant characters about the kingdom. But the book of Acts is about the kingdom. The book of Acts is about what does it look like to be a citizen in the kingdom. And one of the things you're going to find out is the world's not going to like you very much. But you need to still be faithful to Christ. You need to live a Christ-like life in this world. And guess what? It may get you killed. But what matters is God's will, God's focus, God's kingdom, and those things last eternally. And so what is very significant, probably the most significant thing in the book of Acts, is the very last word in the Greek, which is the word unhindered. All throughout Luke and Acts, people have tried to hinder God. It doesn't matter what's going to happen to Paul. Things are going to go on unhindered. It didn't matter that Paul was under house arrest and chained to 4 prison guards. The gospel went unhindered. It didn't matter that Peter was eventually killed by the Romans. The gospel went unhindered. And what happens then is Luke has sort of written a continuation of biblical history. He writes like the author of Joshua and Judges, unintentionally, so that we see this as that Luke and Acts continue biblical history. But with this word unhindered as the very last word in the book of Acts, then it suggests that we are continuing biblical history. Right? And so it raises the question, what type of stories are people going to tell about us and our faithfulness to the kingdom and how we imitated Christ in a world that is antagonistic to the gospel message? Right? Luke and Acts together are intended to tell us what it means to live as citizens in the kingdom of God in the midst of worldly kingdoms that are opposed to God. Wish we could have looked at the whole book very in depth, but hopefully just sort of a surface picture gives you an idea of what to look for as you read through the book of Acts in the future. And then we'll have Tim Graham teaching next week.